Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the monthly webinar for ICNA Council for Social Justice. I'm your host, Imam Khalid Abdul Fattah Griggs, the Executive Director of ICNA Council for Social Justice. And this evening, we're going to explore a very topical issue that's impacting and affecting not just those who are immigrants to this country or those who are naturalized citizens, but it impacts and affects all of us. Those of us who were born in this country, every person in this nation is being impacted by the assaults on free speech and the assaults on the immigration policies, very draconian matters methods are being used to silence who are considered dissenters to what the president administration would want everyone to just bow down to. And as a result of this, it's very essential that we have this discussion that part of the mission of ICNA Council for Social Justice is to not just educate people about what's going on as it relates to social justice issues in this country, but also to mobilize, to find ways in which we can mobilize individuals. So I want to, because we have a short period of time together, I want to introduce our very distinguished presenters tonight. And we're very fortunate to have them with us. And, uh, and let me pull this up. I'm sorry. Okay, and first, I'd like to introduce Sister Amy Decore Esquire. She serves as a staff attorney at the Council on American Islamic Relations in Michigan, where she advocates for civil rights and addresses issues affecting the Muslim community. Her legal expertise encompasses combating discrimination, promoting religious freedom, and fostering social justice. Throughout her tenure at CARE Michigan, Ms. Ducore has been instrumental in several significant legal actions that have led to settlements and awards totaling over $1 million for Muslims across the state of Michigan. Beyond her legal work, Ms. Ducore has emerged as a credible voice for the Muslim community, appearing in various media outlets. She was featured in our Detroit magazine, discussing the challenges and experience of being Muslim in Michigan. Additionally, we are fortunate to have with us Sarah Kogade. She is an immigration attorney and co-director at Project Anar. Her passion for immigration is rooted in her personal experience as a first generation Afghan American. Sarah has been actively involved in the immigration field for many years and has been involved in the immigration and legal services in California and at NAR since 2023. And finally, and not, of course, not least, we have Sister Golnaz Fahimi. She is the legal director of Muslim Advocates. She has worked with and for historically and structurally marginalized people across a wide spectrum of contexts and strategies. Her experience and expertise encompass deportation hearings, a criminal defense of alleged war on terror suspects, habeas corpus actions, civil rights actions, technical assistance to movement leaders and partners, and collaborative advocacy with them. Most recently, and I'll close on this, that she was a senior staff attorney at the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center, leading this work at the intersection of immigrant justice and disability justice. Now, I'm not doing justice in these very short uh, introductions with the kind of resume that all of our guests tonight have. But let's go, Naz. I want to uh, start with you, and I want you to address the issue that we have just confronting us all over the nation about free speech and this violation of free speech and how it's tied to immigration and just denial of rights. If you could just talk to us about that.
Yeah, sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Fine.
Great, great, great. Thanks so much for bringing us all together. I think that um, where I'd like to start us off is with what I think is the foundation for viewpoint-driven targeting of non-citizens in particular, and some related targeting that implicates anyone in the US who's been vocal for Palestinian lives and freedom or otherwise critical of policies and practices of the Israeli government, irrespective of citizenship status. I think the foundation for the viewpoint driven targeting that we're witnessing unfold comes out of two executive orders of President Trump. One of those issued on his inauguration day. It's titled Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats. That's a bit of a mouthful. I think advocates have been referring to it by what we see it to be, which is like a vetting and bans related executive order. The scope of that executive order is focused on scrutiny of and targeting of non-citizens in particular. That executive order does quite a lot of different things, but to sort of be responsive to the prompt, among the things that it does is it tees up the specter of viewpoint-driven immigration scrutiny, immigration targeting, and consequences of non-citizens when they're seeking entry into the US, but also non-citizens already present within the US. And it does that sort of through a few different lenses, each of which I think are fairly broad, and I would say staggeringly broad. One of the lenses that it applies to this sort of scrutiny and targeting is non-citizens whose conduct in the administration's view calls for quote unquote sectarian violence, however the administration might decide to define that. Even more broad, though, is the other lens that is reflected in this executive order, which is targeting of non-citizens whose conduct in the administration's view calls for quote unquote the overthrow of the culture on which our constitutional republic stands. And I think the use of a word like culture in an executive order like this is really something worth pausing on together, because I think it's a squishy term that can mean a lot of different things. And I think this administration hasn't been shy about its view of culture, American culture. And I think we need to understand it to mean culture sort of read through the lens of white supremacism and Christian nationalism. And so I think what this means is the specter or the likelihood of ideological or viewpoint driven targeting of non-citizens for different kinds of immigration consequences on the basis of viewpoints that the administration is hostile to. I think that is a consequence or a risk that's precipitated by this executive order. The other executive order that's relevant to ideological targeting or viewpoint driven targeting is called Additional Measures to Combat Anti-Semitism. And I think in advocacy circles, we're referring to it by what we understand it to be and do, and we're understanding it to be, in essence, an anti-Palestine executive order. This executive order is not limited in its scope to the interests of non-citizens. This executive order has implications for everyone in the United States. And I want to kind of unpack the different things this executive order does. Chief among the things that it does is it embraces a definition of anti-Semitism that allows for the conflation of anti-Jewish hate with criticisms of the Israeli government, its policies and practices. And I think that based on that definition, which allows for that conflation, it does a number of other things. It directs the heads of federal agencies to identify to the president any and all civil and criminal legal frameworks that the administration can use to seek accountability for anti-Semitism, the way the administration has defined it. It asks the US Department of Justice to sort of do a survey of existing court cases around the nation that implicate anti Semitism, the way the administration defines it. It directs federal agency heads to take stock of civil rights complaints that have been submitted through those agencies that in any way implicate anti Semitism, the way the administration defines it. And last but not least, it specifically directs agency heads, federal agency heads, to provide the president with recommendations for quote unquote guidance that the administration can disseminate en masse at scale to campuses of higher education all around the country so that those campuses, quote unquote, can monitor for the conduct of non-citizen students that in the administration's view maps onto terrorism-related grounds of immigration detention and deportation as interpreted by this administration. And I think it's worth uplifting to everyone joining us tonight that terrorism-related grounds of immigration detention and deportation are breathtakingly broad in their scope as it is. They have allowed for example, the targeting of people whose sort of like conduct amounts to having been on the receiving end of violent force or abuse of actors who have associations with terrorist entities. So I think that's worth pausing on. To be sort of shoehorned into a category because of having been a victim of members of that category tells you something about how breathtakingly broad these immigration grounds are. And they've been sort of weaponized against our communities going back across administrations. But I think it really is a huge concern to know that it's a prerogative of this administration to seemingly aggressively interpret those grounds and then give instructions to campuses around the country about how they can be complicit in monitoring for student conduct in service of federally defined governmental objectives that are deeply harmful and deeply repressive. And so I think one of the things that advocates and advocacy circles are really sort of urging is for campuses around the country not to take the bait and not to capitulate. There's an important role that campuses can play in this climate to sort of draw the line against this kind of top-down federal pressure. And it's really essential that they do so. We're mindful of the pressures that campuses face. The federal government is threatening campuses with withdrawing federal monies, for example, right? And that's a very coercive tactic. But we really need campuses to understand now more than ever the duties that they owe their constituencies, citizens and non-citizens alike, and to really lean into what they state their missions to be, which by and large is to be places that promote learning, promote robust dialogue. And so we really need campuses now more than ever to toe the line. I think I'm happy to answer questions or sort of follow up further downstream, but I'll pass the mic back to you, Imam Griggs.
Okay, very good, very good. If you could just give us one example or a couple of examples of how the government infringement on the free speech on the campuses, what are some of the what's actually happened, not only to the universities, but to individual students and groups of students?
Absolutely. So I think that the targeting of student speech on Palestine has had a lot of consequences that my peers and I on this call and advocates around the country are witnessing in real time. So I think there are some very specific very deeply harmful and repressive forms of targeting that have taken aim at non-citizen students in particular. So a lot of the targeting that's happened against them, driven by their support for the lives and freedom of Palestinians, has made headlines. So people may be familiar, for example, with the immigration detention and targeting of Mahmoud Khalil, an alum of Columbia University, has Palestinian heritage himself, and was really sort of instrumental in the campus advocacy and activism over the last year to decry the catastrophic state violence that many consider to amount to genocide. He has been very specifically targeted because of his role in that advocacy. There is a growing list of students, Brother Griggs, that whose cases are also grabbing headlines, and who are being sort of snatched off our streets for no other reason than they have spoken out to decry what amount to war crimes and human rights violations that many people the world over have lent their voices to condemning. There are other things that we're seeing happen unfold on campuses. We're seeing how hostile committees of Congress are trying to get their hands on student records for the purposes of witch hunting. And there's pressure on campuses to turn those records over. And there's a lot of fierce advocacy trying to get campuses not to capitulate and to otherwise forbid the provision of that kind of information when we know that the motive for seeking it is to witch hunt. So that's another sort of flavor of threat that campuses are under right now. And then the funding threats that I mentioned earlier, Brother Griggs, is like another really significant aspect of the dynamics at play right now on campuses. The federal government is basically threatening, and in many cases making good on its threats, to take money away from campuses to try to coerce them into being complicit in these federal projects of repression and state violence is what it amounts to.
Right, right. Thank you so much for that. Um, Sister Amy, I will go to you next. Could you address, I know CARE has been so involved, like all of your organizations have, but you've been very involved with volumes of cases defending the rights of immigrants, as well as the free speech issues that are so pervasive in the society today. Um, but I think also your organization, the CARE, has put together a wonderful kind of roadmap or a guide to know your rights and what you can do. Can you share with us something about this and any other issue that you would like to address about immigration and the
Sure.
immigration violations?
Sure. So I thank you for having this. I think this is such an important topic at this time. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that the U.S. Constitution and our Bill of Rights, which is where our rights derive from, they really protect every person found in the United States, right? I think that's really important to understand. Like, it doesn't matter what your status here is, whether you're a citizen, a lawful permanent resident, a student, or even if you are without what quote unquote legal status. If you are a person who's found in the jurisdiction of the United States, you have constitutional protections. And I think it's important to remind people that, because I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of hopelessness right now, especially amongst our immigrant students who are facing such like tough repression from the state that we're under right now. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that your rights are not self-actualizing. They don't just materialize because you have them. It's important to know them. It's important to understand what they are, and it's important to actually exercise them. And by exercising and enforcing your own rights, you're making yourself safer, but you're also making everybody else safer, right? Because if we're abdicating our rights to the government or to the state, eventually there's going to be no rights left to take away, because we've given them all away. So I think those are two really, really important keys that I wanted to mention straight off. But the other thing that's important to know, if you would have asked me 2 years ago or last year even, we had this conversation with students. I was meeting with students on a regular basis, student advocates across universities in Michigan, and this idea of the international student came up. Excuse me, and how How afraid should they have been regarding their free speech? If you would have asked me a year ago, I would have been like, you shouldn't be afraid at all because your rights are protected. And now we can see that that's just not the case, right? So, like, technically speaking, every person has the right to free speech. Every person has the right to, there's very, to say what's on their mind, especially if it's political speech, right? It's political speech happens to be the most protected type of speech. And what we're seeing is like an attack on political speech based on viewpoint across the country, and it's very, very scary. We're going back to a time that harkens back to like McCarthyism, right? Where we are. I think Sister Golnaz talked about a witch hunt, and that's kind of what we're on here. But everybody has the right to free speech. There are very few types of speech that are not protected. And those are basically like inciting actual violence, like, hey, let's go commit this crime. That's like one of the only types of speech that's not protected. Even speech that makes us uncomfortable is protected speech. And I think that's something that this administration has forgotten in their desire to shut down speech. So we have to like continue to enforce our rights. And when we're talking about what are we doing to protect our communities, and what are we doing to enforce our rights, a lot of that has to do with law enforcement encounters, right? And I use the word law enforcement when I'm talking about ICE and CBP in a very like loose term because they're not actually law enforcement. They're not in the general context of what we could consider when we're talking about police and FBI and people who are investigating crimes. They call themselves law enforcement, but so we'll call them law enforcement for this exercise. But everybody has rights when it comes to like interactions with law enforcement. Yesterday in Michigan, we saw a bunch of pro-Palestinian homes of student activists being raided. Like 4 homes, 7 people or 8 people were impacted by that. But each one of them knew their rights, and it's important to know what your rights are. So anytime any person is interacting with law enforcement, it's important to remember that you never have to answer any questions. It doesn't matter who's asking the question. You don't have to answer questions, and you should be firm in that. If somebody from law enforcement, whether it's ICE or FBI or your local police agency, comes up to you and wants to ask you questions and is investigating a crime, you don't have to answer those questions. And you can firmly state, I don't have to answer these questions respectfully. I'm not going to answer. I'd like to have an attorney present before I answer any questions. And one of the first things that when we're doing Know Your Rights presentations that we talk about is your right to walk away, right? If you are encountered by law enforcement, the first thing you should do is ask them, am I being detained? And if you're not being detained, you walk away. Literally just walk away from them. There's nothing they can do to stop you. And if they try to persist and ask you questions, you tell them respectfully, I'm not answering your questions. And, I'm not going to answer any questions without an attorney. Something that's like equally important that I think is important for our immigrant community to understand is that ICE, if you encounter ICE or CBP in Michigan, we have a particular connection to CBP because the entire state's a border state because of the Great Lakes. So we see CBP engaging in traffic stops in Michigan, which is something that's unique, I think, to Michigan and Texas and maybe New Mexico. But if they encounter you, they can't ask you about your immigration status unless they have a reason to believe that you are not lawfully present or you just had a recent border crossing. So, and it has to be, it's a fancy term that we use in the law called reasonably articulable suspicion, but it really means they have to be able to tell you why they're stopping you to ask you this question. And if they can't, it's not a lawful question, and you don't have to provide any information to them. They can't just do checkpoints looking for people and just go into communities that are known to be immigrants and start asking people for papers. That's not lawful. So we have to know our rights. And so anytime you're encountering law enforcement in public, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to walk away if you're not being detained. You have the right to ask for an attorney. And especially our immigrant community should never sign any papers that they're handed before their attorney looks at them. And one of the things that happens to our immigrant community, including our lawful permanent resident community, is they're asked to sign paperwork. And they're saying, if you sign this paperwork, we'll let you go. And what ends up happening is they've relinquished their rights to remain in the United States voluntarily without understanding. And then they have to start the process over. And that becomes like a big hurdle. So like, I think the key takeaway, Imam Khalid, is that everybody has rights. And everybody should be exercising those rights. And sometimes as Muslims, we want to be helpful, we want to be kind, we want to be seen as respectful. So sometimes we are willing to indulge some things that maybe we shouldn't indulge, so that we don't make bigger problems for ourselves. But the real problem comes when we don't exercise those rights that we're given, to keep ourselves and our community safe. And those are sort of the takeaways, I think, from what Kara and other advocates are trying to teach people when we're out here in the community giving these types of lectures.
Yeah. You mentioned the rights that we have in an environment like we are suffering from or experiencing at this point. It seems that there is less respect for the individual's rights. And so we have to be able to overcome this fear factor, and we have to be able to still stand up for what we know is constitutional, and what our rights actually are. I think it's a very important and very useful contribution that CARE has made in publishing this Know Your Rights. And I think all of us should carry that around with us. We should have that with us at all times. Sister Sarah, um, you have a very long experience, not as much in years, but in experience in dealing with numerous immigration cases and numerous immigration situations. And I want to thank you too for joining us, because
I'm happy to
you're
be here.
standing in for one of your coworkers, and we're very grateful for that. But you're very much qualified to be a part of this session here, this forum. So could you tell us about some of the immigration issues that are currently, that you or your organization are currently attempting to address?
Yes, and hi, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and but sad that my coworker could not make it. She is a joy as well. But thank you for your question. Yeah, so I'm an immigration attorney at Project Anar, which stands for the Afghan Network for Advocacy and Resources, which is super aptly named because that is exactly what we try to provide: advocacy and resources. And this latest administration has given us a run for how quickly we need to get some of those resources out. But I always like to mention that, we've been, we emerged out of a need that existed and came to be during the Biden administration, when the US troops withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving everybody in danger and in chaos, trying to find lawful pathways to the United States. And then even those who did come to the United States through evacuation needed support once they got here. So as far as the issues that we've seen, it has changed and evolved over the last 4 years now since that evacuation took place. And some of it is unique to the Afghan community, but as we've seen with the new administration, much of it is applies not just to the larger immigrant community, but specifically to Muslims who want to immigrate or who have immigrated here. So some of the more recent issues that we've seen have been the Trump proposed travel ban, which everyone was in anticipation from, and from his first administration knew that it would be primarily Muslim majority countries who would be affected. As far as we can tell, that list, like a draft of it came out that did have a majority Muslim countries on it, but it is still being put into effect in the form of visa revocations, through vetting, through pauses in refugee processing, things like that. Excuse me. And which is obviously causing a lot of harm and grievance in our communities, as people are just on the brink of being reunited with their families, but suddenly there are indefinite delays, pauses, or other issues that are coming up. So that's one of the more recent issues that we've seen that affect just immigrants at large. That doesn't specifically affect Muslim communities, but it is targeted towards them. We've also seen something called TPS, which is temporary protected status, has been terminated for multiple countries. And for anyone who's not familiar, TPS is basically a status that protects people who are in the United States for a specific amount of time, and that can be renewed. And it's usually designated for countries who have some sort of danger or turmoil. Countries like Venezuela, Afghanistan, Cameroon. There is a short list, but you have to be eligible based on really specific basic criteria of being in the United States at a certain time, and having lived here or stayed in the country for since entry. And the Trump administration has started to terminate TPS status for many designated countries. And this is very impactful because for those who have approved TPS, the benefits of it are that you cannot be detained and you cannot be deported or removed. So it's a huge protection for those who come from countries where they would be unsafe if they returned, regardless if they have a claim for asylum or some other specific relief from removal. And this is, it's a terrible way to continue to terrorize our communities. And again, immigrant communities at large, these countries are designated specifically because of the issues that are back home that make it unsafe for people to return. And to take away that protected status is causing a lot of confusion because people are not sure what forms of relief they're eligible for, what other kinds of things they can do to protect themselves. And I think we can talk more about that later about what they can do.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to bring up the issue that has recently come to CSJ's attention. And unfortunately, it seems like it's been going on for a few months now. But in the state of New York, in New York City in particular, children, one as young as 4 years old, are being forced to appear in these immigration hearings without the benefit of parent, a friend, or attorney. And how do you force a 4-year-old into an immigration hearing who's just recently been separated from their family?
Mm-hmm.
And so just egregious kinds of violations of just basic humanity we're seeing. So can anyone address this issue? Because it just sounded so outrageous that
Yeah.
so
I can
yes.
mention just briefly just some of the ways that the policy changes make something like that possible. I know that there has been a memo that came out, and Amy and Gulnaz might be more versed in this, but that the procedures of who can accompany a minor to court have been severely limited. And so that's a form of creating, disconnecting people from their communities and really narrowing down who can be of help in that situation. And maybe Gulnaz and Amy might know more about this, but that's just an example of how the policies come into play, and you see things like that, like 4-year-olds presenting by themselves.
Yeah, I think related to what Sarah has pointed out, there's an additional facet that kind of is driving the fact that kids so young are being made to like go it alone in their immigration court cases. So historically, there have been some amount of federal monies that have gone to fund the provision of legal services for this category of kids who, as a matter of law, it's a term of art, but they're usually called unaccompanied minors or unaccompanied children. So among the things that the current administration has done is claw back federal monies that have had the dedicated purpose of funding legal services for the very purpose of helping vulnerable kids who are unaccompanied, who are alone and on their own, have a legal advocate by their side. So this is a very deliberate and very cruel move on the part of the administration that tells you something about the extent to which they do or don't care about procedural protections, basic fundamental fairness that is like a core value in the Constitution as a matter of due process. And as Amy pointed out earlier, like so many of the protections that the Constitution affords extend to persons, extend to people who are present within the United States. And I think this tells us something about how the administration is trying to reinvent who gets the privilege of the status of personhood. And I think it's a very ugly, deeply cruel aspect of their policies. I think it's something that shows up all over the place in their policies. They are really trying to narrow in on and reduce who among us and in our communities gets to count as a person.
If I could just add on to what
Sure.
Golnaz and Sarah already said, I think it's important to remember that some of these unaccompanied minor children that are in the United States without protection were not unaccompanied when they got here, but the Trump administration, in his last administration, created the situation under which these children are no longer with their parents. Many of them crossed with the border with their parents and were removed from their parents in a very cruel and harmful fashion, and have never been reunited with their families because the Trump administration lost the records of who they came to the United States with. So they created a group of children that are parentless in the United States and are now taking away the protections necessary and the money that is needed to keep them safe here in the United States. And I think that's just another important facet of the terrorization of immigrant communities that's going on by this administration since as far back as his first term in office.
I'm going to add one thing, if it's okay, Brother
Sure.
Griggs, is just to
Sure.
say that the Trump administration claims that it's not doing in its current iteration the wide-scale family separation that it had been perpetrating during its prior tenure. But that is false as well. And family separations are still ongoing in the following form. We have been hearing from advocates on the ground who provide services to people close to the southern border that family separation is alive and well because by and large, families who come from Muslim majority countries, there's a sort of loophole as a matter of law that allows for the separation of parents from kids if there's sort of putative danger that can be ascribed to the parent, and allows for their sort of immigration prosecution. And so I think before the southern border was sort of formally shut down by President Trump, family separations were ongoing and impacting families who come from Muslim majority countries in particular. And I think Amy's point is really well made, that it adds insult to injury for the administration to deprive vulnerable kids of legal protection, whose vulnerability the administration has created.
Yeah, that's a very profound statement addressing just a hideous attitude and a misimplementation of the law of the land. You know, I know the basic topic this evening is about immigration, but I want you all to comment on this as well. And that is that the danger to the rights and liberties of all American citizens and everyone in this country are being threatened. And I've talked to a number of people, and they have this attitude, well, these are immigrants, and maybe they should be here, maybe they shouldn't be here. But when we see the kinds of actions and the kind of inhumanity that's being perpetrated against just innocent people and who may be here legally, or if not here legally, they don't deserve in any stretch of the imagination the kind of treatment that they're getting. And I'll just say this real quickly, and I want to get you all's comment on this, that it's almost every person in this country has to be concerned about this. And the Muslim community in particular, because so many Muslim nations are being targeted with their immigration and his future travel ban that he says he's just looking at it first. It's going to be much more extensive than what was put in place before. But the one thing that really gives me pause is to look at Trump invoking the 1798 Aliens, Enemy, and Sedition Act. And what he ended up doing was, and how this was used and misused decades ago, was when the president during World War II invoked this act and just rounded up and put in just concentration camp conditions the Japanese Americans who were businessmen, and most of them were American citizens. And not only that, but they had so much property. They were into agriculture. They owned so much of the farmland out in California. And so they lost all of this. This was just taken from them, just tax paying Japanese American citizens. And so none of us, regardless of our citizenship status, uh, we can ill afford to ignore what is going on in this nation today. It's been decades since we've seen anything comparable to this, in my humble estimation. I've been around a few years now, and I've seen a lot of stuff happen in this country, but this just seems to be next level for just the last uh, few decades anyway. Any comments about the concern that not just immigrants should have for what's going on, but all of us, and the need for us to work together because our safety depends and our freedom depends on all of us coming together and working together on this.
If I could speak to that, I think that your point, Imam Khalid, is like right on point, honestly. Because if you look back to the Japanese internment, it really shows it really shows us who at any specific time can be determined to be a true American, right? Because the narrative at that time was that the Japanese Americans were not actually Americans. They were repeatedly called an immigrant community. And that's why what happened to them was allowed to happen by the American people, because they were deemed and portrayed as an immigrant community, despite the fact that many of them had been here for generations, like sometimes 3 and 4 generations. And that's something that's forgotten. And that's something now that has been turned around on the Muslim community, right? We continue to talk about how Americans are, we call it like Muslim Americans, and how American we are and how many generations we've been here. But no matter how many generations Americans have been here, they're still perceived to be an immigrant community. And in the eyes of some, that makes them lesser, makes their rights lesser or lesser available for their rights, right? And I think Sister Golnaz talked earlier about these executive orders and the vague language that's used in many of them. And you can see this administration turning back and hearkening back to the time of the Japanese internment by using these broad sweeping terms like harmful to American culture. What is American culture, right? But that's used in several of his executive orders. Hostile to American values. What are American values, and who gets to decide that? So this otherizing of the communities and portraying them as something other than American or other than American enough, it stems directly from that. So the use of this Aliens Act is pervasively hostile towards communities that have already been marginalized and others are perceived to be not American enough, and it should scare everybody. It should.
I completely agree. If it's okay, I'm gonna sort of add something to the mix here, which I think like emphasizes everything that Amy has offered us. So I think like we all have cause for concern when the administration is sort of putting in its crosshairs very powerful interests that are its ideological viewpoints, or that have dared to sort of, in the administration's view, cross the administration. So one of the things that I've found like kind of bananas, just to be very plain spoken with you all, in terms of the administration's sort of executive actions, among the executive orders of the president, are executive orders levied against named individuals or named against like very powerful law firms that in the administration's view have crossed some sort of line that the administration has defined to be a red line. And so I bring this up to sort of say that even for people who may be tuning in, who would say to themselves, but I'm American enough. I don't have to worry about being part of a category that Amy is sort of pointing out. I would actually say think twice because if you cross the line in terms of criticism, even of the administration, there's no telling sort of how you could be targeted too. And I think the examples here speak for themselves. If powerful and sort of moneyed interests are among those being targeted, there's no sort of limiting principle here that would allow anyone to say, oh, but not me, not me. I'm safe. I don't think so.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
if
if I
I
can,
could,
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to add really quickly that as Amy mentioned in the beginning of the presentation about the Bill of Rights applying to everybody in the United States, I think a mistake that many American citizens make is that, well, if you're not a citizen, due process doesn't apply to you. But due process is what distinguishes, is what leads to the determinations of, if to the extent that there are distinct differences in rights, that is how you determine what applies to you and what doesn't. Mahmoud Khalil not committing any crimes and being abducted from his home in front of his pregnant wife without he didn't commit a crime. He didn't even have a student visa, which they had accused him of. It is because of the lack of due process that he is detained 1,000 miles away from home. And so due process needs to apply to everybody, or else there's no way to distinguish. Not that we should, but to the extent that we think that there is differences, you couldn't prove that without due process.
All right. I'm going to ask our technical person here this evening, Ramiz, if there are any questions that have come up, if you could display that for us, and our guests will try to address these. Okay, in the separation of Muslim children from their parents when they immigrate here, the same thing as what has happened in the Hispanic community when the parents send their children here unaccompanied. Is the separation as a question? Who would like to address this?
I think I'm going to take a crack at addressing it. I would say the
Okay.
short answer here is, in essence, yes, it's the same kind of outcome. It's driven by the same kind of rationale and motive, and it tells us something about who is viewed as like welcome, worthy, desirable, of belonging in the United States. And I think the administration keeps answering that question for us in terms of its perspective. So I would say yes is the answer.
Okay. Ramiz, any other questions? First, I didn't know this type of thing was happening to Muslim families, that is, children being separated from their parents against their will and permission. Okay. Who would like to address this one?
I think it's related to the last comment. The thing that I'll kind of clarify is that although the prior Trump administration became really notorious for its forced separation of migrating parents from their children, and that got litigated and kind of ultimately resolved through a settlement agreement, which is a binding agreement that the administration is subject to now that it's back in power. There is a loophole in that agreement that allows for separation of parents from children if danger can be imputed to the parents such that they can be subjected to immigration prosecution. And the point that I tried to flag earlier is that our allies on the ground, advocates on the ground who try to support families trying to seek safety through the southern border, they have reported that this loophole is by and large weaponized against families and parents who come from Muslim majority countries. And just to sort of underline it, the idea here is that danger is imputed to them, very likely solely on the basis of their national origin. So that's something that persisted even through the Biden administration, and I think is, hugely concerning. There's a larger harm in play now in terms of any access to the southern border being shut down. But the status quo ante definitely involved family separation still. And by and large, impacting families who come from Muslim majority countries.
Yeah. In that first iteration of the Trump administration, when he was separating the children from their parents, it was just unconscionable and reprehensible. He actually had these kids in cages like they were animals, and was on full display to try to discourage, I guess, to try to discourage others from coming into the country. So there's the ceiling, or not the ceiling, but the floor is a little deeper with this particular administration than it is with many of most previous presidential administrations. Next question, please. Hi, what is next and toward ensuring these rights expressed here are complied with by this lovely administration? Good sense of humor there.
I think one of the
Steph,
things,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think one of
No,
the
no,
things
no, no. Go ahead.
one of the things that's important to remember is, like I said, rights are not self-actualizing, right? They don't just appear because they're granted to us in the US Constitution. So we have to enforce our rights. I tell people sometimes, like we get a lot of questions, what if they take my electronic device at the border? What if I'm stopped at the border? What if they detain me? In different scenarios. And I say that could happen. Just because you have the right doesn't mean they're not going to infringe on it. And one of the things that's most important to understand is that's why we have courts of law, right? When the government does something, and that's why, as Sister Sarah said, due process is important, our court systems are important. When your rights have been infringed upon, the way that you reinforce your rights is you take this administration to court. And we've seen it already. We've seen it with birthright, the revocation or the attempted revocation of birthright citizenship. We've seen it with Mahmoud Khalil and his and the lawsuits that he's now engaged in. So when the administration does something that is against the Constitution, the court can step in. That's why we have the separation of powers, right? We have the balancing of powers between the three branches, and the judicial branch is the final check on the executive branch when they're doing something they should not be doing.
I'm going to add something if it's okay,
Sure.
which is sort of to drive the point home about why all of us, regardless of citizenship status, regardless of whether we think our rights are vulnerable or not, need to be concerned by the behavior of the administration. To Amy's point, the role of our courts is to enforce checks and balances against the other branches of government, the political branches, including the executive branch, the president, and all of his agencies. That's part of their constitutional role. And I think best case scenario, they come through with decisions and orders that draw that line and say, no, 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 you can't do this, or you must do this, those sorts of things. One of the things that I think is a serious thing for any of us to be worried about, no matter whether we think we're vulnerable or not, whether we are convinced we're American enough, we should all be concerned when a presidency and his agencies decide not to care about court orders. And there have been reports in the news that there are examples of this. This is a huge concern for any of us who cares about the rule of law, whatever other vulnerabilities we think we do or don't have. This is a serious sort of undermining of something that's deeply important structurally for American society, and ought to concern everyone.
Very good. Okay, we are pushing up against the end of this presentation. Are there any, in 1 minute, any closing, any remarks you want to leave our audience with? Can't do it in 1 minute, huh? Okay.
I'll say something quick, but others can certainly chime in. Like, one of the
Okay.
things that Amy and Sarah have pointed out are the power that people have sort of in themselves as individuals and in community with each other. And so I think, like, to try to end things like on a hopeful note and on an empowering note, whatever the dynamics are right now, they're not like the end of the story. There is something that all of us can stand to do through our sort of individual will, through our collective will. Strength in numbers is something that is real. It's something true. And I think now more than ever, it's important to remind everyone of that, that they have power to kind of condemn things that are wrong, to be in community with each other, to agitate for the things that they know to be right. And I think in our communities, because there's so much of a sort of strong fabric of togetherness that is rooted in faith practices and rooted in other things, I think there's a really important opportunity to recognize the power that people have and share that is especially important in a time like this.
Yeah, that's excellent. You know, what you said, it reminds me of old Star Trek series where Dr. Spock would do the mind meld thing, because you kind of said in a much more articulate manner how I wanted to close it. And so it's no need for me to try to rephrase what you so articulately put forward. I want to thank each of you, and especially Sister Sarah, for your stepping in at the last minute the way that you did, and you did such a wonderful job. Sister Amy, Sister Gomez, you all have been great. And we hope that this information that was imparted this evening will not do anything to discourage our activism and discourage us from taking a stand. Because if we just lay down and don't respond, and I mean even outside of the courtrooms, part of ICNA, Council for Social Justice mission is to try to help mobilize people, to turn out people in the street, to show this administration and local officials and state officials that we are watching and we are concerned. We're not just going to just watch the news and not do anything when such, just terrible things are happening within this country. So again, I want to thank you all so much. Do not be surprised if I call on you all again to come back, because this is a continuing discussion. There are continuing developments going on. And so we so much appreciate you all joining us this evening. So on behalf of ICNA CSJ, I want to again thank you all, and I'd like to thank those who took the time this evening to listen to this most important discussion. Assalamu alaikum.